All right, so welcome to our session, Creating Reentry Housing with ESSHI. Actually, a show of hands, who is interested in developing housing under ESSHI for the reentry population? Okay, awesome. So you're in the right place. And just a little plug, we do pre-development and acquisition financing. So if you're interested in getting any lending products from us, just let me know. But I'm Patricia Hernandez, and I'm the director of the Metro Region at CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing. For those that don't know us, we're a national nonprofit, and we call ourselves an intermediary for supportive housing. So we don't run or operate any housing ourselves, but we work across the country to ensure that there's supportive housing available to communities that really need it. And we do that through our lending, as I mentioned. So we have some lending products that kind of early stages of pre-development, and then the acquisitioning. We have a large training center. We do a lot of policy reform, and then we have our programmatic and technical assistance work. And I oversee our metro region, which includes New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So a little bit about today. So we're going to introduce our wonderful panelists here. Super brief overview around the intersection of homelessness and justice. You all are here because you all know that this is an issue. Talk a little bit about what ESSHI is and where we are with numbers, specifically around reentry, and then really the meat of this presentation is hearing from the providers who have been doing this work. So what are the challenges, what are the benefits, what they hope to see, and then open it up to the audience. We would love to have a robust discussion, so don't feel shy in raising your hand throughout the session. So I'll hand it off to my panelists to just say a quick hello and why you decided to join this panel. Christina, do you want to start first?
Sure. Is this on? Okay. Is it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christina Green. I'm the Director of Supportive Housing for the Osborne Association. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been doing supportive housing for the last year, so it has been challenging. What? Oh, sorry. It has been challenging. There's definitely been some challenges. And we'll discuss that further as we move on. But again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Sorry, Annie.
Hi, good morning. I'm Annie Murphy. I'm the Deputy Executive Director, I don't know my own title apparently, of HousingPlus. We are a 20-year-old organization that does permanent supportive housing. We focus on women and gender-expansive individuals and families. We also serve the reentry population, and we have a continuum of housing programs specifically for those who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, which includes transitional housing as an alternative to detention, women who are unnecessarily detained at Rikers, and then transitioning them to permanent supportive housing programs, both through ESSHI and rapid rehousing. And it's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to talking a little bit more about our ESSHI programs.
JoAnne Page, can you hear me? I'm the president and CEO of the Fortune Society. We're a 55-year-old organization that works with and by and for formerly incarcerated and criminal justice impacted people. I've been there 34 years of the Fortune's 55. And I think that housing is transformative. We backed into housing about 20 years ago because we couldn't find decent places for our homeless clients to stay. I'll talk about ESSHI and what the pluses and minuses are and how we do housing after this brief introduction.
Hello. I'm Alethea Taylor. I'm the executive director with Our Children, Our HOUR, the hour of her arrest, the hour of her visit, and the hour of reunification. We focus on women who are formerly incarcerated. We work in New York State 2 prisons, Bedford Hills and Taconic, along with Rikers Island. And then we have housing in Long Island City, well, in Queens, I should say, but primarily Long Island City and Astoria, Queens. We also offer, when a woman comes home, the opportunity not only for housing, but we have 2 thrift stores, so if you like thrifting, come see us. And we also have a food pantry in Long Island City, because you know food security is an issue. And we offer mental health and mental health and substance use services, as well along with child care. I'm so looking forward to learning from my colleagues up here and my colleagues in the audience, just to know more and to be able to service our women in the best way possible.
Wow, the women power in this panel. So, like I said, super brief, just talking about the intersection of justice and homelessness. So we know that formerly incarcerated people are almost 10 times more likely to be homeless than those without an incarceration history. We see rates highest for people of color, people incarcerated more than once, women, people with a recent release from prison. And we also see that women are more likely to be homeless than men, but men are more likely to be unsheltered, meaning that they often end up on the street while women may end up couch surfing, transitional settings, etc. And one thing that, I have to mention is we know that this population faces a lot of discrimination when it comes to housing and a lot of significant barriers, whether that's in affordable housing or supportive housing. We know that there are some programs that are supportive housing programs that you have to be, and a lot of people coming out, well, 100% of people coming out of the state are not considered chronically homeless, and most people coming out of Rikers Island are not considered chronically homeless because the average stay is about 222 days. So we see this as a big issue. We also know that while NYCHA is doing better, there's still a lot of exclusionary policies for people to reunite with their families. And then, I think kind of finally, there's landlord discrimination. We hear it all the time. There's not a lot of evidence because people can say, I'm just denying their apartment for X reason, which is why fair chance for housing is very important. So about 7 years ago or so, Governor Cuomo created what's called the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative. So this was his answer to de Blasio's 1515. So Governor Cuomo decided that he will create about 20,000 units of supportive housing statewide across 15 years. And this was one of the first times that the government funded programs outside of New York City. So it was really a large investment in outside of New York, upstate New York housing, which there's a dearth of. A few highlights from this program that make it unique is the homeless definition. So while I mentioned just a little while ago that a lot of the supportive housing you have to be chronically homeless, for this program you do not. Just the mere fact that you're exiting jail or prison and have some sort of housing instability qualifies you under a person being homeless, which has enabled lots of people now to access supportive housing that they couldn't before. What this also does is, if you look at the middle column, there's a lot of populations here, and it specifically calls out the justice impacted population. So it really wants to find opportunities where there's housing for young adults and adults who are formerly incarcerated to get into housing. Just a little about the funding, right? It's up to $25,000 in services and operating for each unit. There's a lot of advocacy around increasing that, especially for New York City, as rents rise and services get more expensive. So that's something that we're definitely supportive of and been working with the Supportive Housing Network. So where we are with ESSHI development, specifically for reentry, again, remember there's tons of populations. Actually, probably one of the highest is behavioral health and then aging. And then there's reentry, right? So right now we have 221 ESSHI reentry housing units open. That's great, but small. And there are 150 in New York City. And then if you look kind of in the future, there are 140 units statewide in construction and 100 of those in New York City. So we're making our way, but we know we're not there yet. So just wanted to share a little bit about this report that CSH, along with the Supportive Housing Network and many of the partners here, kind of looking at the Rikers Island population and seeing who actually needs supportive housing. And we believe, and this is definitely an underestimated account, in 2020, we saw about 2,500 people in that year that would need supportive housing. So these are people who have no housing upon release or upon entry and have significant behavioral health issues. Again, this number is probably really low. A lot of people don't identify as having a behavioral health issue, and there's not a very strong screening process around housing. So we know this is an undercount. And especially now as the jail population rises, we see that this is going to rise. So we estimate this by looking across the country, and we see supportive housing eligibility. It's about 19% in each of the jails kind of across the country. So we kind of estimated that here. So as you can see, right, we have a little bit of ESSHI. We have JISH, which is Justice Involved Supportive Housing, and that's only 120 units. But we have probably well over 3,000 people that need this. So we definitely need more housing, and this is why I'm excited for the providers to really talk about what it's like to build this housing, the importance of it, and how do we get there. So I will hand it off to JoAnne.
So I'm going to try to take my allotted 7 minutes and not run over because I could talk forever about this. So the Fortune Society, as I said, is 55 years old. We are only serving people with justice involvement or a history of justice involvement. We've evolved to have really robust wraparound services, including most definitely housing, but also licensed mental health clinic, licensed behavioral health, licensed substance abuse treatment, employment services, alternatives to incarceration. Pretty much one-stop shopping. Our deepest service, and I think our most life-changing service, is our housing. And we have a continuum from emergency to transitional to permanent supportive. And permanent supportive is mixed with affordable. ESSHI is a game changer because if you want to do reentry housing, to emphasize what Patricia says, 1515 excludes almost everybody coming out of jail and 100% of those coming out of prison. And most of the permanent supportive housing that's available requires chronic homelessness. And folk who come out of incarceration didn't do time in the streets and the shelters sufficient to be chronically homeless and have at least as many issues and needs as the people who are prioritized. So what we've done, we were asked by New York State to replicate our housing model in upstate New York. And we did technical assistance for Community Center for Community Alternatives, which did a joint venture with the Syracuse Housing Authority, because they have a visionary commissioner who thinks reentry is part of what a housing authority should be dedicated to. There is a mix of ESSHI, emergency housing, ESSHI, and basically affordable housing for the permanent supportive housing. We did the funding proposals before ESSHI was available. And I'll talk to you more about what that was like in terms of invention and fantasy and scotch taping and wild leaps, because we needed to show that the services were in place for a building that was not yet built and not yet funded and was several years away when funding doesn't work that way. But I'll talk with you about that. But what we are doing now is running an ESSHI program in a joint venture that we did with Bronx Pro in a senior building where we have about a third of the units. And as is our model, we call security residential aides, and they are a part of the program staff. And we tried early on to use rent-a-cops, to use purchased security folk, and it did not work. We really were experiencing front door people who didn't reflect our culture and values. And I think that the ability to have the people who see the residents most often in tune with their needs and identifying when something's going wrong and being an ear and being a welcoming smile is a really pivotal part. So we have 3 experiences with ESSHI. One is where we did the technical assistance with the Freedom Commons program in Syracuse. 2 is with our senior building, which is a joint venture with Bronx Pro, and we'll talk more about joint ventures. But we do the security using our RAs. They pitch in for the cost, and it's a senior building with front door folk who feel like a concierge. And that's really important, and with wraparound services on site. And then we are going to be closing on financing for our East Harlem building. And we will be mixing ESSHI and 1515 because we can't make a building pencil out with ESSHI because it's $25,000 for everything. And New York City is not anymore giving out Section 8 to subsidize the rent. And it just ain't enough money. So we built in 1515, which limits our flexibility about who we can take in, but pays better, and it makes the building pencil out. So these are the choices we've made. We are thrilled with the flexibility that ESSHI gives us to take anybody based on need and to serve the reentry population. And I have a letter on my phone from an attorney who is preparing a clemency application for a man in his 60s who's done 44 years, who will not get out without housing. And ESSHI lets us promise him a bed. So that's the end of my 7 minutes.
And I just want to echo that. So we've been, CSH, along with some colleagues of ours in the justice and housing space, have been talking a lot to judges, DA's offices. That's the thing. No one is going to let anybody go with a mental health issue into a shelter. So we're really thinking about how do we design these flexible programs that are low barrier and can get people directly into housing. So it's something that we hope to try to do more of, for sure.
I think that if I can add a half minute, we have a continuum of care, right? We have pretty much 400 emergency and transitional beds, including in the castle and including from our Mock J contract. So we can house somebody at the moment and wrap them around and assess their needs, and then we can move them along into our permanent supportive housing or others if it's available. And the lack of availability is the problem.
Yeah. Christina?
Thank you. So the Osborne Association's been around a little bit over 90 years. I was actually once a participant of the Osborne Association not too many years ago, and here I am today. So I'm super excited about that. Osborne, very much like Fortune, we have workforce development programs, substance use disorder clinic, many ongoing, for women, people, not only the justice impacted, but the justice impacted families as well, which I think is very important. We're also in a lot of the upstate prisons to try to do the continuum of care when people come home. I think that's really important. My project, well, Osborne recently, last year, it's almost been exactly a year, we have a supportive housing at Marcus Garvey. So the population there is over 50 years old after long-term incarceration, unstably housed or homeless. So we have 52 units. The average time of incarceration is 27 years. Recently, we have one person that was there 50 years, another one 44 years. The average age is 57 years old. Myself and my staff, I hate to say my staff, my team, all of us, we're all formerly incarcerated. We're all over 50 years old, and we know what it takes to reenter society. So with that in mind, we put in place a whole bunch of, last quarter, I think we did 28 ongoing programs, including tech support, financial literacy, and a lot of peer support. you know, the world has changed tremendously coming home after, 27 years of incarceration, being dropped in New York City. A lot of people have no families, they have no support system, so we are their support system. And I'm very proud of this project. It's been very successful so far, fingers crossed. But like I said earlier, there has been some challenges, with different partners and, property management companies and things like that, trying to collaborate. Osborne is currently, we're starting a project with Annie here, Shiro, for transitional housing for women coming home from Rikers Island. And in the works is 202 beds for ESSHI funding, for ESSHI beds. In Brownsville, 2 of them will be in Brownsville, 88 beds in Brownsville, and then 1 in East New York. So that'll be upcoming in the next probably 3 years. So we're just looking forward to kind of stepping in. This was our first one, so we're learning as we go. I think the next ones hopefully will be a little bit smoother. But that's really it, I think. Is that it?
Great. It's fine. Annie, do you want to go next?
Hi. So I just, a little bit more about HousingPlus. We are really a housing organization, as our name would indicate, and the plus is an indication of the services that we wrap around all of our participants. So actually, our first housing program about 20 years ago, which means we're the baby at the table, and probably the smallest also, was actually an alternatives to incarceration program for 12 women who had the opportunity to come live with us, which gave them the opportunity to reunite with their families and finish their court obligations and sentences within our program. Many of those women are actually still in our program. Once their participation time in that program was done, they were able to move into permanent housing, and none of those women have been reincarcerated. So that's very exciting. Now we have 220 units of permanent supportive housing, and we have, I think, 3 congregate supportive affordable developments in the pipeline. We have 1 ESSHI program, which is 30 families, and it is also our first congregate supportive housing partnership development. So for us, it was a first time being in a congregate setting, being in a new development, and the first time having ESSHI. So as we were navigating ESSHI, we were also navigating a congregate setting for the first time. All of our housing prior to that was in scattered site. We opened the program in May of 2020, so all of our families moved in during the pandemic, so that was also another element that we had to navigate. Everything that had always been done in person was now being done online. And it was very exciting because we moved all of our families in between the end of May and the end of August during the pandemic. So that was pretty exciting. I think one of the things that I wanted to focus on just in terms of our ESSHI program, and we do have 2 ESSHI conditional grants also coming up. We have 1 that's already in construction. That will be a 60-40 unit building, and we'll have 74 supportive units. The one following that is hopefully, it's in pre-development right now, and we're looking at probably a 2026 TCO. That's also about 74 supportive units. Our current one is a 30% supportive unit, so it's a little bit smaller. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on was just how important this program was in our continuum of housing for individuals that are reentering the community. We have a mixed population in our ESSHI, so it's a combination of SUD, SMI, and reentry. But as Christina indicated, we have a program for a transitional housing program. It's an alternative for women who are being unnecessarily detained on Rikers. And one of the most important things is to be able to provide them permanent housing, after their stay with the transitional housing. As everybody has indicated, the ESSHI provides us the flexibility to work with these women and gender expansive people because they don't have to be chronically homeless. And it also provides us with the opportunity to provide referrals directly from where they're at. So they don't have to enter the shelter system, which is a positive in many ways. If they are able to come to a housing program, whether it's transitional and permanent, and have those level of supports directly from their stay in incarceration or alternative incarceration, it's going to provide those supports right away. And be able to start working with them right away and decrease the possibility or the likelihood that they'll go back, rearrest or go back to prison or jail. So we had found ours was one of the first programs in New York City that had an ESSHI re-entry program. And we found the ESSHI work group to be incredibly supportive and incredibly helpful. You could tell that they really wanted to have this program work, and they also acknowledged that this is a new program, and we're serving not a new population, but a new population through these kinds of grants, and so they needed to be open to doing things a little bit differently. And for us, that meant a referral process that really worked. We were able to create a referral process with them that was sort of separate from all the referral processes that we use for all of our other programs where we're taking individuals and families specifically from the shelter system. So it really helped to streamline the referral process. We were able to create a referral process where all of our participants came either directly from Rikers, directly from prisons, or directly from alternatives to detention, alternatives from incarceration programs. It created a consistency and a continuum that was supportive throughout, and 11 of the 12 participants came from our SHERO program that we've been talking about. So these housing providers were already working with these participants, and then we were able to continue working with them, creating that sort of consistency. So I think that and I can speak a lot about the security and some of these other issues that are challenging, but one of the things that I really wanted to focus on is how ESSHI really allows for a referral process and a continuum for people reentering society that no other grants and contracts that I know about do.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Can you imagine someone kind of being at Rikers for well over a year, because as there usually are, with all the trauma, and then have to go into shelter for another year to qualify? How terrible that is. So that's probably one of the biggest highlights of this type of program, is that you don't have to become homeless when you're already homeless to qualify for housing. Alethea.
Hi, so Our Children has I would say it's a unique platform for housing in the way that it started 37 years ago. We were started by nuns who took in women's children. We were housing children who mothers were incarcerated. And so the nuns raised those kids in a housing that we currently still have called My Mother's House. It's called My Mother's House because a child went to school one day and they kept saying, where's your mother? We don't see your mother. You always come with a nun. And so the nun said, just tell them you're coming from my mother's house. And so that's, it's a way to really protect that child. And to also make sure that they were raised and not a return into the system. And so that's, in a way, that's how we've started our housing services. And from that, we moved to communal housing. So some of those women coming home got their children back, and so they moved into the house. They were able to find housing through working with the nuns and moving into that particular facility. From there, we established other communal houses and communal transitional spaces, meaning that people have single rooms and then they are sharing a living room and dining room area. And then in recent years, we've now have 47 units of permanent housing where we have 2 buildings where we're serving women that are in reentry, but we're also able to take justice-impacted folks. Usually they're folks who are associated with the population. So they're children of some of the women that are incarcerated, that are inside, have received permanent housing. And then we also have the ESSHI, which is included in that 44 units. That's in, we have a development with DNL Development Group. We have a joint venture with them, and we have 26 units in a building in Jamaica, Queens. This is our first ESSHI project. We have 2 buildings. We're in 2 buildings, I should say. We have, later I'll talk about the complicated relationship of the joint venture. But we do provide wraparound services to those women in that particular program. And we do supportive subsidies for those women as well. I think one of the most, I forgot to say that we also have, we're funded through the Shero Project as well, where we serve single women and women with children in our programs through that grant, and it's afforded opportunities for women to come out of Rikers Island and come in more immediately to homes. I think some of the issues that we face around housing is that everything else that you all face is the substance use and the mental health issues, and we're seeing more women with serious mental health needs who have kids, and so that's also been challenging in meeting the needs of that population. But the great thing is the ESSHI grant has afforded some significant wraparound services and dollars that could be used towards not only things like just making sure that they have a housing, but making sure that you can be able to provide soap so that you can do laundry, so that you're able to get transportation funds, because when you come out, it's much more difficult to move around New York City when you don't have funding. So to be able to use the money in a unique way, for us, using Uber for women who are afraid to take the subway system because of mental health and other needs. So this is why this particular grant has also been useful, and we've worked in partnership with our grants manager to make sure that we can do some of these unique opportunities. And we see them unique because years ago you couldn't use certain funding to do certain things. So that's been extremely helpful in helping this project forward.
Yeah, and you guys might know better, but when we were doing our paper around kind of the need for supportive housing in Rikers, I think we saw for women who were there, about 80-something% of them had a behavioral health issue. So it's pretty high. Yeah. All right. So I think now we're going to get into more specific discussions and get into some questions and then open it up to the audience. So I know you guys talked here and there about some of the benefits. Anything else that you'd want to add around the benefits of the ESSHI program?
I would like to echo what Alethea said about partnership, because all three of our ESSHI projects are with OTDA, and they are partners. They are true partners. They're flexible. They're supportive of innovation. And HHAP has been that for the capital side. So I think that having true partners who are not rigid, who are willing to go with whatever the needs are, and when the needs change, or when you identify new needs. The one negative is the 25,000, because we're forced to take 15-15 to make the building pencil out, and it rigidly restricts who we can take in.
Yeah, and just to kind of mention for those that don't know, the $25,000 includes operating and services, so which is not a lot of money. Whereas in 15-15, the services are separate and they're $10,000, and then you have operating at a different rate.
They're
so
actually $17,500.
What was 10? Oh, for the yes.
For 15-15
For scattered site, yes.
15-15 congregate also.
Congregate as well.
Yeah, they're 17.5.
So that's a big difference.
And you can tell when you subtract 17.5 from 25,000, there's just a nickel left for operating. And what that means is you're pinching services or pinching operating or hustling other money.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add? So I think, one of the things that we're hearing from kind of supportive housing providers across the board, whether they're serving a reentry population or any other, is that it's been really challenging to find social support services, right? And making, there's a lot of people with a lot of high acuity needs. I think we're seeing more and more. So has there been any challenges on the social services side when supporting this population that anybody wants to talk about?
Sure. I think for us, I don't know necessarily so much the social services side. I would say it's The challenges often are with the management company that we're working with in order to meet some of the needs on site. So ensuring that we have access to space has sometimes been challenging because you're not only utilizing the space for your group, but there are other residents and tenants in this particular housing unit, permanent housing. So that also can be challenging. As I said earlier, the having women with severely mental health needs and when they're not able, don't want to take the services, or they are intertwined in your program and you do need to provide them services, but they are able to refuse services. So you have to really get creative on how to get them engaged. And a lot of times what we're doing sometimes now is engaging their peers to engage them, which we find has been quite helpful and resourceful. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to engage them. And then also being able to, I think when you're in permanent housing, it's not always easy to get access to the housing so you can see how someone is living and how someone is engaging. And so having to make sure that your social workers and your counselors are developing those relationships where they'll allow you to come into the home. And we've gone into homes where we're like, yeah, there's obviously something going on here because it's not clean and there are issues that we're identifying, and then having to work with that person. And then not wanting to bring in, I'm going to put it in quotes, the authorities, into the equation if you don't have to. So those are the challenges, I believe, for social service workers. And then another challenge that I'm sure all of us are facing is finding social service workers in the right. Or when you find them, the price that they're asking for, but that's a whole different story. So I think those are the other, to work with this particular population, especially when you have individuals with severe mental illness. I also, I think the communication and engaging with management companies around making sure the rent is accurate that they're charging, and that when you do the subsidies and looking at women, that sometimes they are changing jobs in 2 to 3, within the year they've changed jobs 2 to 3 times, and so ensuring that you are doing the right subsidies and that you are communicating with the management company has the rent accurate. We've had lots of challenges around that, and engaging with the management company where, we physically had to go to the office to say, hey, we need to sit down and look at this because this woman's rent is not correct. And so I have one situation now where the woman's rent is not correct, and this woman is calling me every 2 to 3 days. She's very upset. She already has a significant mental health need. And so you're managing that along with managing the management company who's not moving things forward. And we're saying all of this today because these are the types of things that if you're going to go into this type of relationship, that you should try to negotiate for in the beginning. Like, how do you handle these things? Boy, if you could pick your management company, please do so. So, so I think those are the kinds of challenges in making sure that there is significant communication. The other thing that I would have loved to be able to do, I just got into this organization a year and 5 months now, but I think if there was a way to really engage the management company and train them about the population that they're working with, would be so helpful. And so in conversations with the person that I'm working with, I do some education around the population, what their needs are, why she's doing this, and how to handle it when she's irate. And that you getting to her level is not going to help any of the relationships, and how do you de-escalate conversations. These are not things that we think about when we're doing housing work and working with management companies, but these are the realities of the relationships, and so that relationship is so extremely important. And so those are some of the social service areas that have been, I think, important and challenging.
Yeah, we do a training at CSH around property management and supportive housing, and it's the most popular training across the country because it's such a need. Like, these are the folks that are interacting with your tenants on all the time, and they have no expertise in the area. So it could really make or break kind of what happens in your building. how your property management are they mission driven? Do they have the resources to connect when there's issues going on? So definitely echo a lot of training for property management. Anybody else want to add to that?
I'd like to add to that. I've had similar situations with the property management company, with billing issues, them not understanding our population. Oftentimes, like my population, this is the first time they've gone to prison as young people, 19, 20 years old. They're coming out as senior citizens. So this is the first time they've even had their own apartment. And when they get the bill and it's wrong, and they're showing several $1,000s owed because there was a billing, mistake, it's very triggering for them. So what I've done, with any organization that you work with, you have to find the right people. And I've gone through several people within the property management company to find the right one. And recently I found a group that is willing to work with us. I often invite them over. I'll come over for coffee. Why don't you come have coffee? Do you want something to eat? Let's talk about it. Let's, talk about each participant and what their needs are. Also with their security, so they have security for the entire block, which we're not a part of some of the Marcus Garvey housing, which they oversee as well. So I have a very good relationship with the head of security, because how they handle it, when the police come or parole comes, my residents, the last time they faced a police officer was the last time they came home. So for them, I had an instance where they wouldn't even come out of the apartment, and I'm like, please, let's, come out. You're not going to go to jail. Let's talk about it. So I've just recently been able to develop a really good rapport with the property management company, but this first year has been so challenging in that, and with the security company. And I was listening to JoAnne, maybe we should just do residential aids. But the problem with that is that it's 52 units among low-income housing. So it's not just our people there. So that may pose some issues. But the security team, they're, I don't really know. I want to be real transparent. They don't get paid much. They hire these kids, and they don't really care who comes in the building. And I'm in the middle of Brownsville, and it may be a dangerous situation at some point. And I need them to be aware. I need them to be aware that some of our residents have severe substance use disorder, may have mental health diagnoses, and at any minute things could change, really quickly. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and I guess it would fall under this, is that what I've recently noticed is within the last year, we've had 2 participants pass away. So they're coming home from prison, and one of our first thing, and it's also one of our deliverables, is to connect immediately to primary care. So we have a really good relationship with the Institute for Family Health and FQHC, but I also work very closely with JASA, and they come in and they do, they do a lot of wellness and health classes for health homes and things like that, and that's been super helpful. But I've also noticed that we've had to install a lot of disability equipment. People are aging, and they probably, they'll die in that building, if they stay in the building. So they're going to need more support as we go. We've had to install different kinds of equipment and things like that, because they're already coming home in their 60s, 70s. So that's just something I wanted to mention that I forgot. Thanks.
Something everybody should think about. All of your tenants are aging, and they're going to continue, which is a good thing. And just to know, we see that people who've been homeless, institutionalized in jail, prison, age at a faster rate. So where you think, somebody who at 67 needs X, Y, and Z, somebody who's been homeless might need that at 50, at 55. So just something to be really conscious of as you start developing your programming. So joint ventures. We talked a lot about joint ventures. Maybe somebody could describe what are they? And then what are some of the benefits and challenges of being in a joint venture partnership?
So this one is something that I really wanted to talk about, because this is an engagement in a long-term relationship, and you don't want a 30-year marriage that is bad. And what joint ventures are 2 organizations, usually a nonprofit and a for-profit, engaging in what may be a more complicated or a more simple relationship for a building. And it could include an ownership share. With our Syracuse technical assistance, the building is owned 50-50 between the Syracuse Housing Authority and the nonprofit Center for Community Alternatives. Or it could be merely giving you apartments, and you have no say in the management of the building. Nonprofits, I think, underestimate the value they bring to a deal. And we've seen some predatory for-profits that have worked deals that are unconscionable, because nonprofits have the ability to bring operating money in and to get favorite status for capital funding. We've experimented. We've had a co-developer relationship for our Castle Gardens. We have a consultant relationship for the 3 buildings that are in our pipeline now. I'll toot Amy Laravere's horn because she's a brilliant consultant. But we also have done one joint venture that we're about a year into in terms of running the building. And it's with a publicly minded nonprofit that has a history of doing joint ventures and doing them with a social service provider. It's Bronx Pro, and they had a long-term relationship with SUS and have done numerous buildings with them. So they're seasoned in working with nonprofits. This was their first endeavor, working with formerly incarcerated homeless people, although they had worked with homeless people before. And they basically looked at us for guidance in what it took to do a senior building where maybe a third of the building was going to be occupied by our clients. And they contribute money toward the cost of security, but we run the security for the whole building. And that's culturally, that would have been a cultural non-starter, because for traditional security, it would not work for our population. It would be like a burr under the saddle. It would be a continued irritation. We work collaboratively with them. We recently were approached by a for-profit that we were unable to negotiate satisfactory terms with and fired as potential partner. And CSH, a number of years ago, put out a manual. We expect part of the developer fee. We expect control over the social services. And we expect control over the security. And we also need to have a workable deal, because with ESSHI in the mix, the ESSHI apartments need to be at very low rent because we need money for services. And that means the building needs to pencil out more challengingly than if we brought in 15-15. So I think that this is a long-term marriage, and you don't want a bad partner, and you want to know what their track record is and what they are offering for your substantial contribution, because the nonprofit is a powerful partner.
Yeah.
Because they bring a lot to the table. And I think most nonprofits sell themselves very short in the power relationship.
Yeah. So date for a while, bring in like a couples therapist, make sure everything's written down.
And
Right.
check with prior partners.
And check with prior partners.
Is this an abusive partner?
And just to know, so the network has this joint venture guide on their website, and it's something that also, if you work with CSH on lending, we can help guide that relationship. It's really important, and we always say, you guys are in the driver's seat. They need you more than you need them. So make sure that you're coming forth with what you need first. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to add on joint ventures? Great. So I think probably there were a few hands here earlier said that they're interested in developing ESSHI housing. So what advice would you give to a supportive housing provider who is interested in utilizing ESSHI funds to develop housing for this population?
So I actually made a list. And what's great about the list is I won't have to expand on too many of them because our colleagues have already addressed so many of them, but I still wanted to sort of present it as a list. So one of them is really consider your joint venture partnership. I had actually written it down as consider being a co-developer because as a nonprofit who has primarily been the social service provider and bringing in the rent subsidy, that was something that was a challenge for us and that we needed to look at differently. So in our first ESSHI joint venture, we were the social service provider, we brought the rent subsidies. And our partner has been great, so it's not that the partner hasn't been great, but we really missed out on some benefits and opportunities that we are going to have in our next two developments where we are the co-developer. So there's financial benefits, there's benefits in the planning, making decisions jointly, and I think just really considering a partner that will work for you and that shares the same goals for the outcome of not just the supportive housing units, but for the building and the community that you're building in general. So that's one. One thing I spoke about earlier is taking advantage of the opportunity to create a separate referral process for your reentry participants that you're serving. And I think just to piggyback on that, really taking the opportunity to work with your state contracting agency. JoAnne's is OTDA, but ours is OMH. And as I mentioned, this is a relatively new funding source, and they have been very open to hearing and discussing what's working, what's not working, or maybe there's things that haven't really been addressed or they don't really have a good process for. And so we've really been able to have a dialogue with our state contractor and the ESSHI work group to help make our program better. And I actually think that it circles around and helps make other programs better. So those are a couple of things that I would really encourage. Also, something that everybody has talked about is pay attention to your security model. Take whatever that means. You want to pay attention to the model. You want to pay attention to the budget. You want to establish a model that works well for an integrated population. And I definitely agree that just having your standard security that you're renting out is not effective. And this is not just an ESSHI issue. This is any congregate, supportive, affordable building. And we've had our own set of challenges in our first ESSHI building. We have a New York City 1515 partnership that we just are in the first year of opening up, and we're experiencing the same challenges. And hopefully we're learning from what we've learned from those two developments. And as we work on opening the next two, we're really going to work hard about putting different models in place before we open them. Another thing that I wanted to just mention, and this might seem obvious in some ways, but the stigma and the discrimination against people who have criminal justice background when trying to get a job, despite the new laws that have been put in place, is still very, very real. And so employment services support, I think, for our ESSHI reentry participants is critical, in addition to the mental health supports. And I think it's not just enough to have an employment services team that's working for these individuals, but it also has to be a team that's building relationships and connections with employers who have an open mind and are criminal justice friendly, if you will. And if it's not something that the budget allows or something that your organization provides directly, it's very important to create partnerships for those services to be provided. Talk to other organizations who have opened ESSHI programs. I think that that's really, really important. You can see that we've all had similar and yet different experiences, and I think that that can go a long way. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is do it. Just do it. To quote to quote our VP of Tenant Services when I was talking with her, this really is pretty much the only housing option that's viable for people re-entering community, and it gives us the flexibility. And while there are some challenges, there's challenges with any new housing programs, there's challenges with any supportive housing programs, but this really provides organizations that are serving the re-entered population with an opportunity to provide them with viable housing and supports. And I say do it because the challenges can be overcome.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one thing that you mentioned that's super important, we talk about trauma-informed care, but think about trauma-informed design and the way you want your building to feel. And that goes for every person who's going to be in any housing setting. So that's really critical, especially for this population. So the last question before we open it up to you all, and we hope to have a robust discussion, is, for each of you, what else is needed in New York to support people leaving jails and prisons?
So I just like to say, a $40 gate fee and then hit the gate with no services is just utterly ridiculous. I just recently went to what was it called? I'm trying to think of what it was called, but it was a simulation of people re-entering society, and they gave these tickets instead of Metro cards. And they had to go to each booth, so you have to go to parole, and you have to go find a job, and you have to go to your doctor's appointment. And a lot of organizations or a lot of companies are not like the Fortune Society, Exodus, Osborne, all these organizations here. They're not like that. They're not going to understand when you have to go to parole. When you first come out of incarceration, you can't take a day off. You don't have vacation time. You don't have sick time. You don't have clothes to wear. So I think one of the most important things is, the collaboration from being inside to being outside. I remember when I was incarcerated, I was in the federal system, and they had like a connections book from like 2004. And I come out, and there's most of the organizations, with the exception of a few, are even closed. And there was no support. I would have liked it better if there was like a direct, here's where you're going to go, this is what you're going to do. And then, people need the tools in order to be successful. And what those look like, people coming home from incarceration, especially during the pandemic. They came home during the pandemic. I used to be a director of another program through the Department of Health, and they were coming home. They had no birth certificates, no Social Security cards, no Medicaid. Some of their stuff, their release papers, was under an AKA in which they were arrested for. And they were dropping people in shelter systems without their mental health medication, and then wonder why people would recidivate. What do you expect people to do? I mean, I've been out for a long time now, but if you take away all my tools, what are you supposed to do? You resort to criminal activity. People are given no choice. So what I feel like they need, and another thing is, you can't, the world has changed. You can't walk into a place and say, oh, here's my resume. Can you look at it? Those times are over, and you have no idea how to use a smartphone, how to use a computer, how to put together a resume. So I think, and now with the budget cuts, like inside the jails, like that's just ridiculous, because that way we could collaborate and say, okay, you're going to meet with this person on the inside, and we're going to connect you. This is an actual person that you're going to go see when you come home, and they're going to help you throughout the reentry process. And people need peer support. People need to understand like where you come from, and social support and family support, because your families, that's a whole box of worms too. You're trying to reconnect with your children, trying to find a job. So I really think that technical support, peer support, workforce development, which Fortune and Osborne has done so well with, giving people with the criminal record, and housing. When I went to get a house, I had to lie. I hope my landlord's not in the room. I completely lied. She said, have you ever been convicted of? Absolutely not. I have not ever. You know what I mean? So, and that's unfortunate. And that's not how I like to live my life, but that's what I had to do to find stable housing. So.
Christina for City Council. Annie, do you want to share your thoughts?
I also think just continuing to change the policies and the laws that give, that aren't against those with a criminal record and a criminal background. And some of those are not even straightforward. And there's a situation now where you know, as a person who has a record, you can get a master's in social work, but you can't get a license in social work. And that's like, what incentive do you have to finish that master's degree if you can't actually get the license and pursue the professional, you know,
You can. It can be a battle.
okay.
We have a Fortune long-term.
I know, it's been a bit, but yeah, and it's
very,
been,
very serious charge.
and it's been a real battle. So I guess technically it's possible,
Right.
but it's been, but it's very, very, very difficult. And if there were different policies and different laws
Yes.
surrounding these kinds of issues, it would be easier. So thank you for clarifying that. But my point is that there really is a lot of legislation, a lot of policies, a lot of rules, a lot of laws that could still be changed that would really change the future and the success for individuals with a criminal record.
Yeah. Did you have a comment or question?
It's more so a comment. I would say that, when we mention all the essential things, you know, learning how to use a smartphone, learning how to get your Medicaid, learning how to get your Social Security, all the other things. But I think there's also a lack in emotion built. So a lot of guys, they could stay busy doing all these things for the first 90 days, but then comes the reality, you know, the emotional trauma that they got to deal with. I think programs such as the ones that we provide help out individuals be successful because they able to deal with the emotional perspective and the pressures of everyday life, paying their bills, you know, making their appointments. So having not only trauma informed but emotional informed services that helps the individual become more ready equipped to cope with their emotions. I think that's
Yeah,
important.
that's super important. JoAnne, do you want to add to this?
Sure. I would tailgate on what my prior speakers have said. One of the policies that is a manufacture system for homelessness is that $215 is all that a single person on public assistance gets for rent in New York City. And we're engaged in teeing up litigation about that because that's a big hole in the bottom of the boat and water comes in. And you cannot plug it with the affordable and supportive housing that's available because it's like sweeping ocean with a broom. So that is a causation of homelessness, and it needs to be dealt with. The $25,000 for ESSHI, ESSHI is a precious resource for reentry housing in a desert of resources for reentry housing, and if it doesn't pencil out, people will be forced to discard it or to blend funding. What housing discrimination does is box people out from affordable housing. And you're never going to cure reentry homelessness if you don't fight for access to market rate and affordable housing. So we and a number of other organizations are advocating for a piece of legislation called Fair Chance for Housing. And Lily, my colleague, and I just spent a whole day in court because we have engaged with a pro bono law firm, and we are suing a major agent for HPD who does blanket discrimination and blocks people's access to affordable housing. So I think a mix of advocacy and litigation and just agitation is really important because the status quo is unacceptable.
Yeah.
It's doing damage. It's creating homelessness and trauma. The other thing, and I'm going to pick up on Limas's point, I think it's important to have a critical mass of formerly incarcerated people on staff and in leadership in the organization, because this is, as Christina said, this is an uphill, traumatic slog against overwhelming obstacles. And to have role models for people who've made it through enforces people's hope that it's possible. And I think hope is a very big variable in whether people prevail against overwhelming obstacles or don't. And I think that we need to have a dual move to feed hope and to tackle those obstacles.
Great.
Oh, sorry.
Did you want to add something
I
before?
just wanted to say one more thing that's been on my mind. We need so much more ESSHI funding, especially for elder reentry, which, somebody that's been incarcerated 30, 40 years, are you really a risk to the community at this point? I mean, are you the same person that you were when you were 19 years old? I know, I don't want to be judged by the very worst
No,
thing
none
I
of
did
us.
when I was 19 years old. The recidivism rate is like less than 1% for somebody over 65 years old. Why not take that money, it's like $550,000 a year to house these people, open more ESSHI buildings. Let us take it, you know what I mean? Let people back into the community. And I just had to say that because it bothers me so much. Thank you. That's it.
I think, I was going to talk about the HRA piece, but the other piece is working in Bedford Hills and Taconic and trying to prepare women to come home is really exhausting when you don't have the right technology and equipment. And I think New York State and New York City should really look at what they're offering people if you're doing rehabilitation. And one of the issues is, so for example, we just ordered new computers. We have women that work inside for us and their staff that are inside Bedford Hills and Taconic. And so they were working on Microsoft 97 to 2000. And so we just got them to 2023 and we had to strip down the computers to almost nothing. But the women were so excited. And it took us time to retrain and train them around new technology and so forth. So imagine if we could bring technology, the cell phones and those kinds of things inside, and the internet, for God's sake, inside so that we can really be more effective when people come home in reentry. I think that's one of the pieces that really make housing work, when people actually understand what's out there, what they're going to face. I can bring a subway map in, but who's using the subway map that much besides tourists? No issues to the tourists. And so, a lot of people using these apps and all these different things. And so we are been talking to our women about that. And there's services there are opportunities that don't exist in the women's prison that exist elsewhere. So those are some of the things that we're changing. But those things help with reentry and help with them coming home and being able to be stable in their housing. Because sometimes it's not only about getting housing, it's how do you help them maintain housing? Because the struggles that you talked about, the trauma, the emotional issues, those are real. And if we can figure out how to address some of those before they come home, but giving them real life examples using technology. So that's one of my goals in working with docs, is to just continue having those conversations and pushing them to make changes to the technology or lack thereof.
Great. And I think, one thing that strikes, and we hear it often around public safety, and we all know public safety equals housing, right? So like there was a survey in New York City, and the majority of the New York City residents said housing is what's going to help us in the community, help communities thrive. So I'm really appreciative of you guys sharing your experiences and all the hard work you do. And we're happy to open it up to questions and comments. So there's somebody going around. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. My name is Raji Deathmangalam, and I'm a social worker at New York County Defender Services. I just want to I just had a thought. I really appreciate what you shared, because I'm thinking about 3 clients who are, thanks to Fortune, in 3 different transitional housing sites. But 2 things that they bring up is no one is addressing their emotional, psychological. One of the clients is constantly talking about the darkness within himself that he's dealing with. It's a different universe here compared to the trauma of incarceration, trauma of homelessness, and it creates a lot of darkness that he sits with. And what he's being offered all the time is sort of, oh, what can you do behaviorally and what can you do medication-wise, but there's something deeper than that. It's despair, it's distress, so thank you for saying that. My question, I also appreciate that the reentry conversation is about jails and prisons, because often they're spoken about in 2 separate, and it's the same person cycling between those. And the last thing I wanted to say is, what I hear from some of the clients, the people I work with, is that they do not, environment is a huge trigger for them. Very often the housing and we all know it's a complex problem, right? It's home. Home can be, for human beings, a double-edged sword. It's also, a community is home, but a community is also a trigger. And many of them tell me they do not want to go back to the locations where they're being put in. And so and this is not news to you, I'm preaching to the choir. How do you navigate this when you're making your, all kinds of stakeholders that you're working with?
I think for me, it's been training of the peers. So we had a past situation a couple of weeks ago where we had two women that have similar mental health issues that have borderline personalities. And if you ever work with this particular people with this particular disorder, it can be challenging not only for the social workers, but it's challenging for other individuals in the house. And so one of the things that we did was we did a lot of education with the other women because they kept saying to us, why don't you just kick them out? I don't understand why, you're not giving them certain consequences. The consequences really is that they just want them to move. And so how do we engage them in conversation about educating? And then we also are teaching some of the women that are friends with these individuals around de-escalation and what that looks like as a friend, and how do you relegate those relationships. And if it's a mom, because one of them is a mom that has a 3-year-old, how do you get the 3-year-old child when mom is at 10 and put him in safety? So those are the kinds of, and when to call us, when to call the social worker if it's late at night. So these are the kinds of things that we're doing to work with a particular population, because it's, we can't cherry pick who comes into our housing. We need to be able to take, to be able to serve a particular population. And so one of the things that we're also doing is teaching more to the disability, in the sense of educating these women about why it's important to do medication, because there's still stereotypes about being medicated for certain communities, and what that means and what that looks like, and being available. And sometimes, I've had to go back to the site, because we're a small organization, at 3 a.m. to deal with something, but the woman needs to be able to engage at that time. So what's the flexibility in your organization? And so we've added additional staffing to really address some of the services, including residential aides that have like a clinical background. Because a lot of times you hire residential aides and they may not have the clinical experience. And so what we're doing is doing more education and having them engage in counseling, but what we call it is light counseling, because it helps really when a woman can talk at night, and so she's not frazzled around certain things. So that's what we've been doing.
I think one of the advantages to congregate is that you can build community, and community is a healing force. I think when people come out and go immediately into scattered site, I don't think that's the ideal situation for people who've done a lot of time, because people who've done a lot of time have been around people, and the isolation is really damaging. I think that the ability to build community also is one of the means that people can be encouraged to engage in mental health services. Because even if you offer them, what Alethea is saying, our clients have experienced medication as a control mechanism and as an attack. And they are traumatized at the idea. I talked to a young man who badly needed psychotropic drugs, but he had been in foster care and in juvenile institutions and in adult prisons where they basically tranked him into immobility. And he was terrified of getting the drugs that he needed. So the stigma and the experience need to be counteracted. And where we've seen it most effective is where other residents who are respected are talking about getting mental health. Because you can't force it, but you want to have people realize that it's available and it's not what they knew before.
Yeah, and Raji, on your point specifically around where people live, choice is such an important piece of empowerment, growth, and thriving. And, it's one of the tenets of supportive housing that the person has choice. Unfortunately, it's harder in practice because we don't have a lot of options for people. But I just want to recognize that that's very important, thinking about where somebody goes back to. And this is why I would love to kind of create more community of providers that can talk to one another, right? Maybe you have a building in this area and that's where that person wants to live. Like, can there be some flexibility in getting people to the places that they want? Because I do think that's important as well.
And that's also why the referral process that you develop with your organization is so important. And if you're also building a continuum, it really provides you the opportunity to work with your referring partners, to work with your participants that are they're in transitional programs or whatnot. It's really important to build that referral process because then you are able to give the participants seeking housing more choice.
Yeah. Basma?
Yes. My name is Basma. I'm a Director of Social Services at Urban Pathways Scatter Site Program. I oversee the Justice-Involved Supportive Housing and our Senior Reentry programs. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the senior buildings and how that looks differently than other housing you offer, whether it is in terms of staff qualifications or services provided or just like the model, I guess, like how does it operate differently, or is it just a building for seniors?
We are all dealing with aging populations, and our Castle Gardens, which is open more than a decade, fairly could be a NORC, a naturally occurring senior community. I think that the health issues, people who are incarcerated show up 10 years older in terms of physical problems. We're having to learn how to deal with dementia. We're having to learn how to deal with people who are not mobile, people who are at risk of falling. I think we're in our own learning curve. We are a year in running our senior program, and I think that the lessons we know about what it takes to bring people home safely when they've served a lot of time are being applied there because we're getting a lot of long-termers. But the medical issues and the mobility issues and the ability to do independent living are really issues we're in our own learning curve about.
And, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I mean, pretty much what JoAnne said, but also one of my case managers, like I said, all of our team there is the same population. We're all over 50. We are all formerly incarcerated. But I actually, one of the case managers has a significant healthcare background, and I purposely hired her for that reason. She had worked with it, in nursing homes and different things like that. I think that what I found out over this last year is having that connection to their primary care provider with their case manager. So I often will, separate caseloads like that for people that have significant health issues will be under her scope, and she'll work directly with the primary care provider, so everybody's on the same page.
I mean, this is something I could talk about forever because health and housing are still two completely different worlds that don't interact with one another. And if you think about supportive housing case managers, not many of them have been trained on navigating the healthcare system. Who knows how to do a managed long-term care application, Who knows what a PACE provider is? Like, these are things that in the health world are very important and are helpful for older adults. So one thing I would say is think about strategic partnerships. Who's in the community that does healthcare really well? How do you engage with a home health agency? Because another issue is somebody needs a home health aide and they don't really, like our people too much sometimes, and our people don't like them, right? So how do we develop and form those relationships? So I'm happy to talk more about that.
One of the programs we've got in the pipeline is a program called Just Home, and it's going to be JISH funded. It's going to be on the campus of Jacobi Hospital, and it will house medically complex people being released who would otherwise be homeless and be released from Rikers Island. And we are facing community opposition that is vicious and racist, and 500 people shouting obscenities at us. But we are going to prevail. But that idea that you have people who are incarcerated and detained who could get out, who have serious medical conditions, who are not suitable, if anybody is, for release to the large barracks-style shelters. And they languish. They languish. And if they're released without appropriate housing, they cycle between emergency rooms and the shelters and Rikers and street homelessness, and they die.
Any other questions or comments we have? Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Taj. I'm actually a senior case manager at Urban Pathways with the 1515 program. My question was for the board. With the ESSHI, is that how you pronounce it? ESSHI initiatives, what type of readiness training or planning do you intend to put in place to assist the formerly incarcerated? Like, I know you guys raised so many great points regarding like resources or like, teaching them how to use cell phones and things like that. But what are some things that you guys are working on, just like regarding policy and advocacy for them? And what are some ideas that you can, tell all of us in the room, like how we can connect and advocate as well?
I'm happy to start off because we are very into the policy advocacy space and need everybody help in it. So a couple of things. One is for Justice Involved Supportive Housing. That's another very low-funded program for people with complex issues. So we've been advocating along with the network and a lot of our partners here to increase funding for that. It's great because it's been in City Council's budget for the last 2 years, including now. It has not been approved by the mayor, so we hope that that's something that comes up. You have to continue advocating for it, and in fact, a lot of the providers who have current JISH funding are refusing to apply for additional funding until their rates are met appropriately. And that's how we kind of stick together. So there's a bucket of money and there's an RFP that nobody has applied for because the rates are just not appropriate. So that's one thing. Another thing that we're working on is around New York City 1515 housing. So I mentioned before there's a homeless chronicity criteria to it. So HUD has the criteria. They just adopted the HUD policy, so there's actually no federal money going into 1515, so they can change their definition. And we're advocating to include jail time as homeless time. So when people come out, they are considered homeless. So that's another advocacy piece. And then ESSHI that we talked about, like just increasing additional funding for that. So for how much for ESSHI? 35,000. So you can appropriately, it's hard, right? You're getting complex people, but if you can't appropriately serve them with the money you have, and then people say programs don't work, but it's because they're not adequately funded when they need to. So we're doing a lot of that, and just in general, we've been, we had some participants from Urban Pathway join some work that we're doing with First Deputy Mayor Sheena Wright's office around decarceration. And around kind of how do we connect people to services directly. So hopefully more to come on that. But yeah, those are just some things on top of my head, but don't know if there's anything here. And fair transfer housing, that's a huge one.
Amen.
Yeah.
So a lot of you on the panel touched on how ESSHI is accessible for people who cannot get into other types of supportive housing. I apologize for the crowd if this is basic. I'm a little bit new to supportive housing, but I was hoping you could just walk me through the process of, like, what does it look like for someone to find your organizations, to find housing, and then how does that differ for ESSHI versus other types of supportive housing? So that's the first question. And then the second part is, what do you wish it looked like? So Alethea, you talked about how access to technology could really improve the finding process. So maybe you want to start, but yeah, would love like the ideal version of finding and getting into ESSHI and supportive housing in general.
So ESSHI is a grant that we have for this particular project. I would say that's how I would frame it anyway. But what happens is the women that are currently in our program are the ones that benefited from this particular subsidy program. They were already living in our communal housing and met the criteria that we developed with the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance. We went after the particular grant. So I would say that any woman that is coming into our programs are able to apply for some of these grants that we get, if they meet the criterias that we have. I mean, we do take women that are not necessarily, so for example, we have some women that are we have a working workforce development program, and we have women that are formerly incarcerated that are not living at Our Children, but they're in our housing, in the work program, so we would be able to work and help those individuals as well. I think for me, I love the subsidy aspect of this program. That's what makes to me so worthwhile, because we had a woman that because of COVID, way after COVID is still here, but 2 years later, the organization that she was with went under. And so one of the things that we were able to do is adjust her rent and to be able to support her for 6 months. But then she also had the working program where she could go and find employment. We actually work a lot with Fortune Society by sending some of our women there for some of their training programs. And so she was able to get employment, and then now she is again being able to pay more of her rent. So the ability, what I love about it is the ability to adjust and to meet the needs of the population, because our populations are not, the women that we're serving anyway, are not getting jobs at 60, 70, 80,000, which is not even that great in New York City if you think about it. But they're getting some of them, jobs that are paying $18, $19 an hour, and to be able to support them as they shift over time, I think is the best part about this particular program.
I sit as the co-chair of our coordinated entry and how people get into supportive housing, and it is complex. It's not easy. So it's really starting off with someone doing a survey that determines eligibility for supportive housing and other programs. Then from there is an entire application that has to be completed, which includes a psychiatric evaluation and a psychosocial, and that's where the hardest part is. I don't know about you, but there's not a lot of psychiatrists just sitting around waiting to do psych evals. So that's been the biggest issue of getting through the application. Once that application is completed and approved, then it tells you what kind of housing a person's approved for. And then that's where it gets even harder, because it's not that there's just a list of housing providers that you get to contact. If you're in a DHS shelter, there is a program under HRA where they're looking at approved applications and are placing people into housing. It's a very small unit, which is why a lot of supportive housing providers here are probably having vacancies coming out of the shelters. That's one piece. And then if you're not in a DHS shelter, let's say you're working with a client in an outpatient clinic and they're couch surfing, they're somewhere else, it's really, unfortunately, up to you as a person making referrals to connect with supportive housing providers who have vacancies. That takes a long time. CUCS offers like a vacancy list, but that's for a specific type of housing. So it's a really complex, long process. And I think, HRA has made it better, but there could still be some improvements. One thing I would know is there are a lot of people actually in Rikers that are approved for supportive housing. I think there's about 2,000 applications that have gone nowhere. So there's people that are actually leaving Rikers with approved applications, but because there's no follow-up, they actually don't get that access to housing. And then one other thing I mentioned so you can't just walk into a supportive housing program, right? They have to interview you, make sure you're the right fit, make sure all the paperwork is available. So it's a pretty long process, and it could be burdensome, and I think there could be some shortcuts, and that's another thing we're trying to work on collectively as a community. How do we make it easier, especially for people who cannot find a psychiatrist or sit through a psych eval or need access quicker than what we can normally get?
So what you're describing is a process that would strain people with graduate degrees in this room who have a stable place to live. And yeah.
Yes.
So what I'm suggesting is if you've got a person who is currently homeless, access the emergency and transitional housing offered by Fortune and other organizations, because we will do the assessment and the stabilization and the advocacy. And we have like 230 scattered site units in clumps of like 10 or 12 or 60, which all have idiosyncratic eligibility requirements. But we know our eligibility requirements. So if somebody comes through our emergency or transitional and they meet those eligibility requirements, we can put them in.
Yeah.
So I think that the biggest door is emergency and transitional housing for people who are truly homeless.
And we need to create these spaces where we're all talking to each other to know that. Like I would say recently ran a Justice Learning Collaborative, people from across, from probation, judges, housing, and the lack of information sharing that happens on a day-to-day basis is astonishing. So how do we create that community and that space where we're all really working together to support people to get into housing and to kind of really eradicate homelessness and discrimination? So that's it
We
for
have
now.
two more questions.
Okay, I'm happy to stay longer. And I don't know if you guys are happy to stay longer. We have questions? Okay.
Hi. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Taylor, and I work for Constructive Partnerships Unlimited. I'm currently overseeing the housing subsidy program funded by OPWDD. So the ESSHI program was introduced to me a few months ago by someone who they applied for the RFP. So they reached out to us to be the provider. So we don't know a lot about the ESSHI program aside from what you guys have been mentioning up there. That is what that's the information that we have. So I did reach out to OPWDD, and they gave me some helpful insight. So I just wondered, because JoAnne said something, and she said something. She said that she titled the security guards residential aides, and I thought that was very important. That's something that, you know, I would need going in on how I would operate the program, right? Because coming in with a security guard may not be the best looking environment, right, for individuals. They may see security guards as a threat. So maybe having someone plain clothes, right, but they take on that role, but they don't look like that, could be very, you know, important in operating the ESSHI program. The other thing
what I would offer is Angela Scott is the person who runs two of our housing.
Yes.
And I would just suggest that you come by and hang out and see what we do.
I would like that.
Yeah, and you know, the best learning is seeing.
Yes.
And
I would appreciate that.
if there is anything in this world that we need is supportive housing specifically for IDD folks. They are lost in our system. Oftentimes they're mixed in with behavioral health, but it's very different and they require different needs and they're not doing well in our general supportive housing and often stay stuck in hospitals. So if there's anything OPWDD can do with ESSHI, I think that's a win, personally.
I'm so sorry. My staff we have an annual Ride Playland trip with the families. So I'm on my way to Ride Playland, so I'm sorry. I have
Thank
to
you
get
so
going.
much.
I want to go with you.
And there's a question back there.
Anybody else? Hi, my name is Victoria Pavlish. I'm working at Breaking Ground. I just want to say that I really enjoyed this session, and I want to thank you for doing whatever you're doing and for sharing your experience.
Thank you.
Anybody
And then
else?
I saw one more. Yeah.
Hello, good evening. My name is Byron Williams. I am the senior accountant at the Doe Fund. One of my questions I wanted to ask, with the recent debate with the debt ceiling, right? And then they want to cut the individual that gets public assistance, as you know, they do, how you should say, a work program. How does that fit into what is the contingency plan for those of the population who's on public assistance who now has to work for their benefits?
That's a good question. Does anybody?
I haven't had that happen as of yet.
Yeah.
That is a really good question.
My guess
I'm
is
sure
that
there's a
the
case manager
individual
out there
case
that knows.
manager
Because
would work
because
to
I know
navigate
this-
that.
Because I know there's some of the population, they're not accustomed to, it's free money prior to this, right? So now you're telling someone they have to work to maintain their benefits. Now, once they work to maintain their benefits, you know, sometimes they might just say, hey, you know what? I'll try to go back on, but how do they make the transformation from working was on public assistance to now back onto it after they've been cut off?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't work directly with clients anymore, but I am sure there's case managers out there that might know. Do you know? Oh. Oh, so I mean, I would assume it's pretty challenging because also the work component, we just talked about how difficult it is to find work, right, for some people. Do you want to?
But I think they're saying that this is a must. They
Well,
have
then then people have to, and if they don't, the unfortunate thing is, remember, any type of supportive housing, you have to pay 30% of your income, and that could be public assistance. So if you don't have that, then you also potentially lose your housing. So it is something that would be important.
Then we're back at square one.
I
Yeah.
think it's,
I wanted to say, I don't want this to sound like dismissive or anything, but I think that, wasn't that part of the debt ceiling deal?
Yes.
Right? So I think that's such a new occurrence
Yeah.
that none of us have probably dealt with it yet, but will
Right.
eventually have to deal
Right,
with
I understand.
Yeah, but I think
Right.
I think we're currently dealing with it because what people are mandated to for continuation of public assistance is participation in drug treatment or whatever. So I think, I think that we are familiar with conditions that people need to abide by or they get cut off public assistance. And this is just a layering on of new situations.
and I think it's important, again, to have, you know, a collaborative team that is, you know, informed and trained and understanding of the changes that are occurring in, you know, policies and benefits, and then having having the staff to work together to support an individual making these transitions. And it could be a transition this way and then a transition back this way. So, you know, having benefits specialists in addition to your case managers, and having, you know, making sure that your employment services team and your benefits teams are trained on these changes, and then collaborating with the other staff.
Okay. Thank you.
Real quick also, in support of what you were saying also, let's say most of the times individuals who do have an open case, and let's say they do get a job, they'll could stop the public assistance, which is the component with the money, and they could continue getting the SNAP assistance. Now, depending on the amount of money they're making, that would determine whether or not they could continue the supportive justice.
I just try and get some education myself, you know, because I've been in support service for a while, so I just want to know what is the step, because it's a drastic move. Because you now have like the population who's have to not work, who's not used to working, and then they decide they don't want to do it no more. So how they get back on the public assistance?
So they reapply. They could go straight directly on their phone. Sometimes they go straight to HRA, but most times all they got to do is just get on their phone, because the same thing they're going to do in HRA, you could do it on your phone. And you reapply and you show them proof of, homelessness or transitional living, and they could automatically reinstate them into their assistance.
Maybe there'll be a training or something around this, because it's something that's going to come up more.
Did you say you were the senior accountant, sir?
Excuse me?
Yes,
You said you were the senior accountant? For
yes,
the,
yes.
So I just want to say I also really appreciate somebody in the finance and the accounting office making an effort to learn some of the challenges and some of the issues that our service providers and participants are dealing with.
And thank you for the ones who stayed at the end. Awesome. Thank you for your question.